Ahoy there, me hearties! This be Captain Silverhook, and you're listening to the Two Old Pirates podcast. Set sail for an open sea of stories, tales, and some really crazy stuff. I expect you to like and subscribe, lest you be walking the plank. Ha ha ha!
Hey, this is Eric with the Two Old Pirates, episode 110. This will be another true World War II story that my dad unfortunately had to live through. I heard this story once, and it's just like the other one, the Japanese pilot. This will be about the nurses and the sadistic Japanese during World War II. Now, if you've ever heard anything about World War II, you know that you've heard of Pearl Harbor. And if you're really into history, you might have heard about the Bataan Death March or the Rape of Nanking. There's many things that happened in World War II with the Japanese military where they literally had no respect for any soldier who would ever surrender because they believed in the Bushido Code, the samurai code, and if you surrender, you're lower than a dead person. You deserve no respect. They had signed up for the Geneva Convention, but when World War II started, they really didn't pay attention to that. They did a lot of horrible things, and I'm not going to cover a huge history of what they did, but during World War II, they looked at any sailor, airman, or soldier that was captured as possible slave labor or someone to practice with their samurai swords on or abuse or just horrible stuff. Now, because there was no internet back then or cell phones or really any type of communication like we have today, you'd hear rumors from possible people that had survived attacks or something about how brutal they could be. The story I'm going to tell you today is a story that my dad said once, and you could tell it had bothered him his whole life. When he was serving in New Guinea during World War II, they were so far away from the real world, as in civilization, electricity. I mean, anything that would be common in other parts of the world, even at that time. But the Japanese were usually either taking part of our front lines or we were trying to take part of the Japanese front lines. It was always wishy-washy going back and forth. And where my dad was stationed with his engineer brigade, they had always heard stories. You know, you hear the worst, but late in 1943, the Japanese had conquered or taken over a small camp that the U.S. Military had. All U.S. Army and a small detach of Marines. But what was different about this camp is when we retook it, of course, the tents had been taken. The Japanese at this point were so far away from their homeland that they didn't have a whole lot left. The food shipments weren't being there, so they stole whatever they could. But what worried people here was that besides the dead that they found, the dead U.S. soldiers, they were missing, dozens of soldiers. So this went back and forth, and after we had some more fresh recruits come in, we pushed deeper into the jungle, and we had a couple scouts find out that the nearest Japanese camp was probably a half mile away. So the United States Army loaded up. My dad was not on this mission. This is what he heard from others that were there that day, that it affected him for the rest of his life. Let's put it that way. What happened was the U.S., in a surprise attack, quickly conquered the camp that the Japanese were in. There was some fierce firefights, and just about all the Japanese went down and laid down their lives. As the Bushido Code, you never surrender. So my dad was hearing this from one of the guys who had His eyes were like about this big. He was in like shock, and he's telling this story to some of them. My dad's all, how soldiers talk to each other. He's basically like, what the hell's wrong with you? We killed some Japanese, Japs. And then the guy looked at him and said, it was the women. It was the women. And my dad and the other soldiers are like, what are you talking about? In that camp that the Japanese had overrun earlier in the year, so it took a good year to overtake this land again and find the Japanese base and the encampment. We had nurses at that original camp, and if you don't know what that means, the Japanese were known for being very, very harsh on women that were combatants or enemies. I'll leave this with you. Look up, if you want to know more about this, the term comfort women that the Japanese kidnapped out of Korea and China. By the hundreds of thousands, they kidnapped them. You can look that up on your own. I don't want to go into that. It's very, very disturbing. The problem here was these were United States military nurses that were supposed to be there to render aid to anybody who was injured. How do you think the Japanese looked at them? Yeah. That soldier told my dad and the other soldiers that were there that were now crying in complete shock that what they experienced as they got into the camp after the last of the Japanese had died was they found some like bamboo, almost like crates. They're cut, tied together, and there were these people living in them. They didn't hear anything. They didn't see any crying or yelling or help me. So as we got closer, as our soldiers got closer to these bamboo huts or cubes, as you'd call them, we had already fixed our bayonets because we knew that once we went into the camp there might be hand-to-hand fighting and we might have to defend ourselves instead of just shooting. As we got closer, evidently our soldiers noticed that the people that were inside, although very, very dirty with matted hair, the hair was long and they had feminine features. They were the nurses. The Japanese, when they overran that camp the year before, they had taken the nurses along with some of the other soldiers. The soldiers they eventually just killed or tortured, but the women were used and abused dozens of times every day. And as they cut loose the vines that were holding these bamboo huts or cubes, the women ran at their own soldiers, trying to have the bayonet stick into their stomachs. They looked like wild women, the soldiers said. They were each trying to fall upon the bayonet and end their lives. They wanted to die. All the soldiers are in shock, along with my father. They're 19, 20-year-old guys. And they're thinking, what the hell? Why would they survived? Why would they try to kill themselves? They were naive. They were battle tested. They'd seen death, but they didn't know about comfort women. They didn't know about things like this. And in their worst nightmares, they never would have imagined that the Japanese would take this step. Yes, the Japanese had raped our U.S. nurses hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. These women were wild. They begged, kill me. Please kill me. Please kill me. They are on their knees begging their own soldiers to kill them. to end their lives. Of course, we couldn't do that. We thought they were overreacting. And as the story started unfurling, coming through, and we realized the sexual crimes that had been committed against them. And the most heartbreaking thing out of this entire thing is after they were brought back and they were brought to a hospital, the stories that they told that leaked out, that I'm sure, I don't know if they've ever been written in a book or not, but this is the history. Some of them during the course of that year got pregnant. And when they were about to give birth and they were screaming in an agony and they're pushing this baby out that was manifested through gang rape daily, the Japanese soldiers were so perverse, they were so evil, that once the baby came out and was crying, they would lift it up by the ankles in front of its mother and then cut its head off in front of her and throw it into the jungle for the wild animals to eat on that night. And then they would close the door and lock her back in there. It happened to several of the nurses. Just hearing a story like that, 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the fact, it's incomprehensible, the evilness. So when we talk about World War II, and we talk about Stalin and how he killed 5 million Ukrainians and starved them to death, and we talk about Hitler and the gas chambers and stuff like that, every single military did tragic, evil things. But at the level of what the Japanese did, we don't talk about them nearly as much as we do about the Germans in World War II. And yet, to this day, they have not ever apologized to the comfort women that they kidnapped in Korea and China. Hell, I don't know if they've ever really apologized to the things that they did to our U.S. soldiers. So in a roundabout way, I hope that you got something out of this story. I hope that you understand that when we talk about these larger things, Pearl Harbor, or, the rape of Nanking, they've written all these books about them and stuff. This is one story of several nurses and the hell that they went through. I will never know whatever happened to them. I will never know if they made it back to the U.S. I'll never know if they took their own lives or became alcoholic. I have no idea. All I know is that my dad at 19, besides trying to stay alive every single day, saw the evilness and wickedness of man. And when it came to women begging to be killed by their own soldiers because of that hell, it's crazy. Anyways, I would like for you to share this with anybody else that you know is interested in history. It is very R-rated, but if we don't tell these stories, they just fade away into the mist of time, and it's as though they never happened.